have shaken 10,000 hands. I have opened several thousand skulls. Out of those several thousand patients that I have cared for, they're not around anymore. When you see cancer patients with the finish line in view, a great majority find strength that they never knew they had. It's the fight that's bringing it out in them.
This episode is supported by Huel.
Rahul, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Pleasure's mine.
What do you believe high performance to be?
There's performance in the racing industry. There's performance in the stock market. There's performing to get the kids off to school. I mean, I think everybody performs at a certain level. And for me, performance is in the operating room. But the lessons from the operating room, I think, can apply to somebody struggling to perform, getting the kids out of bed and getting them to school. What's happening at the brain level when somebody is at the edge of their ability is the same, whether the ability is racing F1 or doing a big brain surgery, or again, just doing the usual things at home, which can be a struggle, increasingly so. So for me, performance is achieving your best under pressure. Yeah. The key is under pressure.
So can you explain then what is going on when we're looking for those 1%, when we're trying to perform highly in whatever our chosen aim is?
Exactly. I think that's the context that's important.
Yeah.
The individual performance is against your best self, your best performance. It's not against somebody else's, because then it becomes, if you look at people who are superstars and high-level performers or athletes, or you look at elite surgeons, if you compare to them, I think it can become frustrating. But performance is within your own context. What I do is I break it into what happens, an acute performance, meaning instantaneous. There's something you need to deliver, a thought or a physical action. And then there's performance over maybe a year. Like, how have you done this year in your career, in your writing? And they work a bit differently. The latter, the 1 year, it's a glacial process that I think draws on creativity. When you have time, when you're not under threat, when it's not time sensitive, you really are trying to extract the best ideas you can. So that's a whole different space in my mind about how do you perform through a year of a long form competition or demand. And I think dreaming and creativity fit into that. But under pressure, there's something going on in the operating room, or there's something going on in the neighborhood. Performing under threat or under pressure is quite a challenging task, because if you have trained, you have created pathways and circuits in your brain. We're not hardwired, but if you train, the neurons you've activated to maybe make the shot or kick the ball or perform physically, they become habituated. And what they do, in my opinion, and when I say my opinion, it's out of respect, because I'm trying to push concepts at the edge of what's known and beyond. In my opinion, what happens is that we deposit myelin. So the neurons, which are like jellyfish, and they have tentacles, the axons. When you do something more to be more efficient, they'll wrap the axon, the neuronal cells, with something called myelin. It's the good fat they talk about in salmon, and the conduction is faster. The good fat provides the insulation for the neurons, which are showering electricity at each other. So if you perform a behavior, a habit, it could be a bad habit or a good habit, your brain will want to make it more efficient. And so performance is practice. Performance is using the least amount of brain energy to achieve that performance, to achieve that physical feat. And then the pressure brings in the elusive part. So a lot of people can perform surgery when they're learning on a cadaver. So the pressure adds interference to those habits, those neurons where you've deposited that myelin. And that is something called emotional regulation. So performing under pressure is training, but also not letting the anxiety of the moment interfere with the training. And so for me, acute performance are those people who can actually be calm under pressure. And that's a skill that can be cultivated through something that's another big space called emotional regulation. That skill that the athletes cultivate under pressure to perform, those lessons apply to the mom or dad at home trying to deal with pressure at work or trying to get the kids off to school. So I try to bring in these big concepts, dreaming, long-form creativity, performance under pressure, and then the lessons that can extend to everybody.
This episode is supported by Huel.
Well, you used a phrase there, Rahul, around these can be cultivated. And that reminds me of a phrase that I've heard you use elsewhere about viewing your brain as a garden, seeing it as seasonal. So I'm wondering, have you got any tips for us on how we can cultivate our brain garden to be more effective?
I worry that sometimes our language gets in the way of the complexity, but then complex language is not graspable. So how do you cultivate the garden in your mind? I think the first thing is we start to see it not as wires. I mean, I've opened skulls, I've got petri dishes with neurons in there. They're not wires. I like to think of it as, microscopic jellyfish, and they're floating in a liquid bath inside our skull. The brain doesn't sit on the bottom of the skull. It's buoyant. It's literally floating in cerebrospinal fluid. And when you think of those jellyfish, they're not directed towards any direction. They're throbbing. And what happens is when you have a behavior or you have an emotion, a little electrical storm, much like aurora borealis or like a murmuration of birds, it's not directed. It's not this way, that way. It's not turn this brain on and I have more emotional regulation. It's sort of an electric flow that happens. And if people think of it that way, I think there's an impermanence to it, meaning just because you felt something yesterday and just because you have a behavior or habit you had yesterday doesn't mean you have to have it today. At the same time, if you've had a good day, you still need to cultivate having a good day tomorrow. If you look at the brain, the limbic system, the emotional brain, this is a well-established thing, is sort of at the center. It's the instinct. It's what my puppy has. It's emotion. It's the places we put the catheters into and tick electricity to address tremors, to address obesity. Primal drives are sort of in the core. And then what happens if you look at our foreheads is the part of the brain that pushed our foreheads forward, the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex in front of the frontal lobes, that's the region right behind your forehead. There are neuronal branches that go from our frontal lobes to our emotional limbic system. And those physical microscopic neuronal extensions can be cultivated through deep breathing to train yourself to be less anxious. They can be cultivated with thought that, does this emotion have a right to be in my body, in my mind? Like the fact that your frontal lobes, the most advanced, evolutionary advanced, the newest part, can reason down emotion, that's the superpower. And people say, well, give me that's really out there. If I put a fake snake on the ground, we'll jump. That's the limbic system. There's no time to think that out.
Yeah.
And that's an advantage. But the second time I put it down, your prefrontal cortex tamps down your instinct. Almost tamps down a reflex. That is possible. You can break your habits, you can break your instincts. And that's the cultivation that I want people to have is, how do I dial what I'm experiencing now? Let emotion flourish. I'm falling in love. I'm having a great time. We don't want to be too tight. I mean, the emotion has tremendous value. Decision-making requires emotion. Or, I'm walking in to see my boss right now, or I'm going into a big game time performance. I need to tamp down this emotion and stay in a rhythm. So that dial, not on off, emotion is never off and reason is never 100%. It's never 100-0. The brain will toggle between emotion and reason, 40, 48, 52. And you're trying to always control that thermostat. And that control of the thermostat is a lifelong responsibility. It's not just an adolescent where we know we go through a lot of changes, but that's something you're working on. And if you work on that, you cultivate that, the next storm that comes your way, you're a little bit better positioned for it. If the storm is intense, maybe you have a child who gets diagnosed, I do pediatric neurosurgery, then nobody's ready for that. Nobody has built-in resilience for that. So, but you've cultivated that capacity. And if you're working on that continually through your life, I think you can navigate the challenges of life better, as well as, enjoy and cherish the joys.
You know, Huel has been a staple of my diet for some time, and I'm currently loving these Huel Daily A to Z vitamins. Tastes great, refreshing. Each can has 26 vitamins and minerals, offering 154 science-backed health benefits. Reduced tiredness and fatigue, normal cognitive function, healthy skin, hair and nails, and vitamin D for immunity. This is a vitamin drink that offers everything you could need it to. So what are you waiting for? Grab it right now in Tesco stores nationwide or at huel.com and let me know what you think.
So what are the things that we should all be doing to train our brain to be able to deal with, not the huge things you've just spoken about, because, you know, have you seen Hamilton the musical? You know, when they sing about Alexander Hamilton losing his child, like, you know,
massive.
We don't want to even consider those things, right? The unimaginable, they call it, don't they, in Hamilton? But what can we be doing so that the daily things that derail us, the stubbing our toe, the losing our wallet, the row with a partner, the aggressive driver on the road, what could we be doing to deal with those things?
So I'll give you a specific example for that. And the big idea here in my mind is that the same concepts apply for that massive, unspeakable tragedy all the way down to the daily struggles.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's not, there's a separate thing that happens. And the thrill of somebody at a university level winning the championship, the brain chemistry, the brain electricity is no different than at the World Cup. So we're all equipped with the same pathways, if you will. So not thinking on and off, we have a reward pathway. We have an emotional brain system, various structures that come alive. We have an important anxiety pathway. You should get anxious under certain situations. But let's focus on that anxiety pathway that tends to get in the way of people getting, enjoying their lives, doing well in life. These different pathways, so reward would drive you towards getting up and going to work, but too much of it also make you an addict. Again, it's a continuum of that reward pathway. Similarly, for anxiety, what is the way we can navigate anxiety in our life? So that's a massive question again, right? First, recognize that anxiety is important. Stress is important. Those people who go to space and they come back down, they have to carry them out of the module. Lack of gravity leads to withering of bone, right? So just like that, lack of emotional intensity, lack of vibrant dreaming, lack of anxiety will actually dull your mind and the neurons in your brain. So you need appropriate anxiety. So I don't think it's got to be, inflammation's bad. No, it's not. You need some inflammation. It's setting the dial. Anxiety's bad. No, actually, in this situation, anxiety might be an ally, but it's bad when there isn't an external situation that warrants it. Okay. So anxiety on overdrive, anxiety on autopilot, anxiety that has no role. And then you say, well, that Rahul, he came by and said, well, there's an interaction between our logical prefrontal cortex and our emotional brain. Why can't I think down my anxiety? Yeah. Well, anxiety is very powerful, and reason cannot, for many people, be enough to say, hey, I shouldn't feel worried during this time. So then what are the built-in mechanisms? What are the things, specific things that we can do? And you got to stay with me for this a little bit. We have a built-in path, an anxiolytic. So that word means, how do you break anxiety? There's a chemical pathway for it. So in the hospital, benzodiazepines, Xanax, Valium, they're anxiolytics. But that's not our approach we want to have in life. So what happens is, just like we can think down our heart rate, so let's say deep divers, they can actually think down something that's automatic that should not be in their control. How does that happen? So this brain-body connection actually has to do with two nerves that come down the groove of your neck. And so the vagus nerve, there's 12 pairs that come out. It's the way you control, when you feel butterflies in your stomach, when you're nervous, it's that sending a shiver up to your brain. When you think down your heart rate and they've got it, a Buddhist monk or somebody who's a deep diver, you say, how does that control happen? So there's definitely a downward brain-body connection, right? And here's what's powerful. There's also an upward connection from how we breathe up to our brains. So I'm just going to give you a little side here. It doesn't matter if it's in one nostril or mouth or not. I know there's a huge field about it, but the nose and the mouth connect right in the throat. They come down a main tube right here. They break into this. It doesn't matter how you get to the trachea, in my opinion. But what we found was when children have epilepsy, so erratic brain electricity, right? We talked about the electric jellyfish. And we can't break it with a pill. The anxiolytic is also an anti-seizure pill. It calms electricity. We put a little nick here. We find the vagus nerve. We put a little coil of metal on it. We put a little pacemaker there, just like a pacemaker for the heart. We put a pacemaker for the vagus nerve. And you can look it up. It's called vagus nerve stimulation. So I'm pulling from lots of different examples to come up with a big concept for people of how can breathing change our brain electricity. Yeah. Well, when we tickle that, not only did it break the brain electricity causing the seizures, the children reported feeling more calm. So that is proof that the brain-body connection going down, as with all nerves, is reciprocal. So the mechanism by which a stressed out parent or LeBron James, going for his game-winning shot is the same. It's to pace your breathing. It's not, I can't control what you're thinking. I can't know what you're thinking. But pacing your breathing, just 5 slow breaths I've done in the operating room, will send calming signals up the vagus nerve to your brain. And that's accessible to everybody. And the key there is not to practice paced breathing in the moment of crisis, but to practice it on smaller elements. So again, it's in your toolkit for coping. You practice it, you're gonna go see your boss, things aren't going well, you think there may be an issue here. You take that moment, the few minutes before, and you just have that time to just pace your breathing. When something goes wrong, I've got somebody's skull open and there's something going on in there, the room doesn't even know. I'll just fight the panic of that you're doing something important. If you don't feel panic, if you don't feel fear, so I'll fight the panic and I'll fight the fear by just pacing my breathing. That is my ally sending calming signals to my emotional brain, as well as I'm 51 now, I think I have more control of my prefrontal cortex, but also saying, you've done this before. You've been in this bad situation before. Pace your breathing. So there's a dual approach to calming down that emotional limbic instinctive part of my brain. Now that's a take-home approach based on big science. And the reason I approach it like that is because I don't like being told what to do. Do this, don't do this. Yeah. Hold this, stand on one leg, eat one blueberry. But how? But why? If you know the one step past it, that breathing can send calming shivers up a nerve into your brain, I think people are more likely to do it.
So what about people that say, I'm just a naturally anxious person, so that wouldn't work for me?
Right. Well, very good. The thermostat is set differently for all of us.
Yeah.
And the thermostat, it gets thrown off course as life hits us with different things. But that same approach, wherever your level of anxiety is, that's your built-in coping kit. Now, does it work for you? Whether it works for you, I can't give everybody those answers because I don't know what life is bringing for you. I don't know. Nobody knows what happened last night. We might have endured terrifying trauma. We might have won the lottery. So I never assume I know what in your brain, what you're going through just based on your outside. And I think for people, that's your built-in anxiolytic. And to take it a little deeper, the paced breathing, not only does it send signals up, see neurons, they don't touch each other, they shower neurotransmitters at each other, right? Like Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake. They don't send the electricity to each other, they release neurotransmitters and they fly out of this little cleft and they pick up on the other side. The same neurotransmitter that this modulates, called GABA, is the same one that the medicine is also modulating. So there's a consistency in what we're finding with breathing, showering the brain with calming electricity and a chemical. That same chemical here in the pharmaceutical world, there's a match. So all the pieces are consistent. That kind of stuff really I find compelling.
Interesting.
We were lucky enough to interview the astronaut Tim Peake, who spoke to us around a psychological effect that he brought back to Earth with him called the overview effect. Where he said seeing the world from outside our atmosphere gives you a sense of perspective. And I was interested when we were preparing to interview you, Rahul, about you've almost had the opposite, the interview effect.
The first time I saw the professors remove the incision was made behind the hairline. So when the patient woke up and the nurses shampooed the hair, the patient was like, where's the incision? I was like, whoa. The incision was behind the hairline. The scalp was dropped down. Holes were made. The forehead was lifted off. The brain wasn't still seen. It's covered in a sheath. And then they picked up the sheath. It's like parachute material. And then incised it in the clear fluid that I told you about. And then I was looking at it. I was like, man, is this even possible? And I think it likely is the same feeling of when you're way out there and you're like, that's finite. This is a globe. It's not flat indefinitely.
There's a sense of awe that comes across in your writing. And the research on awe from like Keltner and John Haidt suggests that has two effects. One, it gives you a sense of the perceived vastness of the world that we're in, but it also then forces you to change your view of the world and shift beliefs. And I'm interested as somebody that's seen inside our heads, what are the beliefs that you have shifted?
So the first thing was, it's beautiful. I mean, it's opalescent. I mean, it's under the operating lights. It's not gray matter. That's for cadavers, right? It's like pearly white. The arteries, it's like a Jackson Pollock painting. I mean, it's stunning. And it's just weird because you go through like flesh and bone. It looks like in the movies, they show flesh and bone.
So is there a lot of blood?
No, actually, that's a very interesting question. It gets 20% of the blood flow from the heart. The heart, when it sends out material, 20% goes to just a 5-kilogram organ. And you think it's you're getting all of this blood coming in there. It should be red. It's white. It has to do with some of the myelin that wraps it. So when you look at it, it doesn't make sense. It's immediately something sacred. And I don't think that's completely ever gone away from. I still have that moment. It's always about the person, the family waiting outside, the pitfalls. I'm running through my drill scenarios. But that first time you see the surface, that's something different. And so that feeling, I think it was something I realized that this is a craft that I will always take seriously. I'm never going to be good enough at this. I'm always going to bring my next level for this. And that was something I had in my mind. So now another big concept you've raised, wonder, awe, these themes that are being thrown around now, flow. I mean, what does that mean, right? Reason and emotion is the modular interplay of brain that is expanding and developing over, not 30,000 years, but 30,000 generations. It's outward and inward. So outward is executive network and inward is something called default mode network, but it's more, I like to call it imagination network. So now you've got all these structures and all these connections, and I have a job to do and it's intense. Certain structures and connections pop up. So what happens in wonder, I think, or if you're operating, you're like, I'm not even thinking about it, and the tissue's falling apart, or somebody's racing a car, and there's this where you're in this liminal space, right? And I think what's happening is you're as close as possible to a 50-50, where it's not mostly executive network. I gotta get this done. Excel word sheet, looking at my calendar. That's 52 executive. Mind wandering, drifting off. That's 52% imagination. But when you're doing I think a physical task, or when you see something and you're looking out at the world, or you're looking out at the frontal lobes exposed, and you're still contemplative and you're reflecting, I think that experience comes from those rare times when both networks are in a true balance. That's my best explanation of wonder, awe, flow, childbirth, seeing the planet, seeing the human frontal lobes.
And what is it that you do to get yourself into that perfect flow state? And this can apply to athletes looking to deliver on a on a field. It can apply to parents looking to get the best out of their kids. What do you do so that in that operation, which means an awful lot to the patient and their family, you're on your A game?
To me, yeah. So I think the answers that have been given before are like with music. You train, but at some point you have to let it go. Dancers, right? You train, but if you're out there running through your maneuvers, I don't know, it just shows. The audience, the uninformed audience can almost smell it, sense it, that this is something rigid.
Yeah.
Athletes, when they ask, well, how'd you make that throw? And I said, I don't know, it's just, for a moment, I wasn't thinking about it. And I think, again, what's happening is, whereas training is 52% executive network, and all the different structures, old and new, prefrontal and emotional and all of it. The executive network pulls from all of those. It's not some corner sitting here that goes, I'm the executive network. It's not. We have to get away from that thinking. That what happens when people let go is the executive network is dialed down. It's brought down from 52, maybe brought down to 51, maybe brought down to 50. And the imagination network, the creative network, I'm not sure how, I didn't think I need to throw this ball at this trajectory. Something is released from you, something instinctive, something built on training. So I think what's happening when people get into their peak performance is learning that they have mastered as much as training can do, and now they have to leave room for something bigger to be released from them. It can only happen if you let go a little bit. In the operating room, if you're thinking about the steps too much, it shows. You can tell when people are learning or people have never mastered their craft. When you use a blade, some people, the blade is like this, always, left to right. But then you see some people and they use it like a paintbrush. And this is all happening inside you. You see the same maneuver is done with a few less steps. The tissue is tugged less. It's balletic. I mean, it is sport. And that takes a little bit of, there isn't a thought in my mind like, oh, don't hold the tissue so strong. You're actually, the executive network is dialed down. You're exquisitely trained. Right, this isn't for somebody like your first shot at it. Like, hey, I dialed down the executive network and I didn't do well. So you're a master of the craft. You've learned all the dots. Then you're letting creativity, you're letting flow, you're letting performance somehow release from you. And then when you see the greats, you see that.
So you use an example in your book on Dreaming about Salvador Dali and how he sits on the back or how he sat on the back two legs of a chair. So his imagination network could go to work, and then when it fell forward, the executive network can kick in and gather it. Yeah.
So when you hear that when I explain it to you, like, wait a second, that sounded way out there.
Yes.
But he's explaining it in a way that you could look up, and he's pulling in different scientific techniques. So, we hit on big things. We hit on the architecture of our brains is interconnected. You turn the microscope on, we're going to see that. We've hit on other big things, executive network and imagination network, that pulling from all corners, but a different set of structures and connections take turns. Now let's explore thought from the electrical patterns it generates, right? 20% of the blood flow goes up here, because it's energetically demanding. It's burning hot. What is that energy being used for? Creating electricity. You put an electrode on somebody, you can measure electricity. You can also send in electricity, shock therapy and other things. That's more conventional, but you put a sticker on somebody's forehead, or 96, the right way to do it, you can detect electricity, enough to actually amp up a light bulb. So the glucose goes into your blood. Your heart pumps it up. It's used by those 100 billion jellyfish, little factories, to spark electricity. But when 100 billion spark in waves, called brain waves, that's what an EEG measures. When somebody has epilepsy, those brain waves are thrown off. But what happens if you don't have epilepsy, and you put the three of us, and you put 96 electrodes on? There'll be a pattern, And so people say, I can't wrap my head around that. Okay, let's back up a bit. If I put a few stickers on your heart, on your chest, and I showed you an EKG, you'd say like, yeah, that's an EKG. That's the electrical pattern from my heart. You know it. You know, it's like on the ambulances or it's on shows.
Yeah.
You know that's from 2 electrodes on 3 nerves on the surface of your heart. What if we took the whole brain, 96 electrodes, and they show different types of brain waves? So what happens is, when you put those electrodes on, if you fell asleep, I can tell, we can tell, the field can tell when you're asleep and when you're awake. And now when you're awake, there's a lot of different brain waves that'll happen. And when you're asleep, we know of 2 very well-established ones that are trippy. REM sleep, but it's rigid at night. When you sleep, it's vroom, vroom, 90 minutes, vroom, vroom, 90 minutes, vroom, vroom. And you look at that, and you're like, that's design. That there's a purpose that's being served there. So sleep brain waves and waking brain waves are different. And then you say, well, when you fall asleep, is it a rigid transition? Like, you know, you're awake and you're asleep? No, like all things in nature. I was diving like in the Yucatan, it was like a river turning into ocean. And there's like a 4-foot period where it was like blurry. The transition from saltwater or freshwater, saltwater, it wasn't like a little vertical line. There's a liminal space almost. Well, what Dali is talking about and what in that movie Inception they're talking about is that when we fall asleep, there's a period about 10, 15, 20 minutes called sleep entry. And at that time, it's your awake brain waves and your sleep brain waves, but at that time, there's a slight overlap. And that's called sleep entry. So the creative, more imaginative, more imagination network, thoughts, ideas are starting to happen, yet the recollection of your waking brain can still pluck a few out. So they're devising new technologies that like you sit there and when you're falling asleep, it wakes you up and you write down what you're thinking. Well, that's what Dali was doing. He was rocking on a chair, and Edison also. And when he would fall asleep, something like a coin in his hand would hit the floor and he'd wake up. And he was trying to extract the thoughts happening at sleep entry, where you're waking brainwaves and you're sleeping brainwaves where they're sort of both present. And that's the science behind how you might be able to get better ideas from that moment. Going back to the original question we had, that's how you perform over a year. You build that into your habits. I do that. Not that way specifically, but more in the morning I wake up real slow, and sometimes then I pick up my phone and I write a few things down. Then I start the day. So that's the performance over a year, how to extract the most creative potential out of yourself. That's a different approach than hitting the game-winning shot.
You need to hear this, okay? Your gut matters. It's a vital building block to health. Now, you might not know that 70% of your immune system is in your gut. I didn't know that. And 95% of serotonin, which is the feel-good chemical, is created in your gut. And if there's one thing we need more of, it's a feel-good chemical, right? That's why when it came to choosing a probiotic, I had to know it was proven and that I could fully trust it. And this is it. Biotic by Heights, specifically formulated to give you everything you need for your gut, your mind, and your immune system. I take it every day, and the difference for me is real. And you could trust me, fine, cool, or you could trust the tens of thousands of high performers and elite athletes that rely on Biotic every day. So join tens of thousands of high performers and try Heights with an exclusive 20% off your first month, only with this podcast. Go to heights.com/HP or enter the code HP20 at checkout. You'll love it.
This is really interesting for me, right? Because I'm a very quick waker-upper. I'm awake. But when I fall asleep, and my wife likes to stay awake a bit later than me, I have these mad, trippy, and I actually wake up, and you know what I think? I can't quite remember what they are after about 20, 30 seconds. But straight away, I think, I can't believe my brain is that incredible to think of that story. And like, I sort of think if I wrote that down, that'd be the greatest novel ever, because it feels so creative and so deep and so vivid and so far out. Mm-hmm. And you think, what is going on? Like, why am I... And this makes perfect sense that my sleep brain is starting to come into my awake brain. So
in your sleep brain, it's more of the imagination network.
Yeah, but there's so much... Then it makes you think there's so much in there.
That's exactly right. So you may not have that experience. I may not. It's not your dream it's not my dream, but it's sleep and dreaming when you look at 10,000 dreams, when you look at 3,000 years of people writing about it, from Aristotle to Freud, you see that pattern. And that's called sleep entry. They call it hypnagogic. It's got a fancy word for it, but I'm trying to bring those down to sleep entry for centuries and in the past, and now understood with the science of brain waves recording the seismic patterns. There are a lot of people that report that.
So our brains are operating totally differently when we're asleep.
They're doing something fundamental. That pattern, that much energy that they're using, that much blood flow that they're using, and they're putting you at risk of injury and predation, that's not happening on accident. So I believe that that sleep is in order to dream, when I believe the dreaming brain is keeping those edges of your brain and mind fully engaged. I believe it's high intensity training for thought and cognition and emotion, that without it, if it were just the day, we would become so narrow. If we were just taking them, just based on lived experience, how inflexible.
Yeah. So not just pretty little thoughts that we
No, it's meant to be wild, so that if you need the wildness of emotion and thought to deal with adaptation,
you trained it.
It's still available to you. It hasn't become derelict. Because if you don't move your arm, it'll ossify. You'll get a contracture. You'll become inflexible.
I think I have an issue with the sleep exit.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Because I wear a Whoop, right? I wear a Whoop band, and it, whether you agree or disagree with that kind of technology, it measures your stress throughout the day. Every single day, the minute I wake up, it shows high stress. And I think I feel the pressure of a couple of kids, a few businesses, lots going on. It's almost like the minute I wake up,
the executive network is back in action.
Straight away.
That's gone.
Straight away.
That's the executive network coming back on action, right? Get back to the thoughts of the day, the acts of the day.
And I think the stress is there because I'm lying in bed, so I'm not doing the things I feel I need to do. And so is that an issue for me?
I don't know what you mean by, is that an issue for you? I think that's the usual thing that busy people who have many demands, when they come out of sleep, there's a mountain of things to be done.
Yeah.
And so the executive network takes the reins. It's 51, 52. I got to do this. Oh shit, I got to wait. And I've been there. When I'd wake up and in between operations or thinking, sometimes I'd have 15 patients in the ICU. You think about your kids and all patient number 1 has got the brain damage. I mean, I'm running through a list of people on the brink. And that's normal. That you've asked to have these adventures. You signed up for it, right? Yeah. I mean, for me, it might be a burden to have nothing to think about when I got up, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But to do those things better, what if you gave yourself an indulgent 10 minutes, if you have that luxury, to say, all of those 10 things that I've signed up to do, I want to do a few things better, but I just haven't been able to crack that code. I haven't been able to break through it. How am I going to be better at that podcast? How am I going to be better at that surgery that continues to be challenging? That 10 minutes of sleep exit and that 10 minutes of sleep entry may be your portal to some fresh ideas that are particular for you in your life.
Going back to the book you wrote before, the current book about dreams, which was about the brain, what is the one thing you would love to leave our audience with a better understanding of when it comes to finding their own version of high performance and the role of the brain in that?
That if you see your brain and the mind that it sprouts as constantly evolving, shifting, electrical flows, chemicals, neurotransmitters, as this ecosystem, then whatever tragedy you have today, it doesn't have to be there tomorrow. And at the same time, whatever triumph you're feeling today, it's your responsibility to continue to cultivate that. That every day, if you looked at the brain at a microscopic level, we are brand new every day. And our dreams keep us fresh every night.
Last year, Jake and I were lucky enough to meet a para-Olympian athlete that had been diagnosed with 6 months left to live, a terminal illness. And it had quite a profound impact on us in terms of perspective and the finality of life. As somebody that is charged with that honour and responsibility of delivering those kind of messages to thousands of other patients, I'm interested in What lessons have you learned about delivering bad news and equally how people receive it?
Yeah, it's heavy. So I think this is where, it's what you wanted other people to walk away with, an understanding of their brain and mind maybe that didn't have, but also maybe an understanding of where I'm coming from. I'm not tackling these topics without some real psychological mileage. I have shaken 10,000 hands. I have opened several thousand skulls. I have 3 sons. I've had my own difficulties. But out of those several thousand patients that I have cared for, most of them cancer from the breast or the body that spreads to the brain, they're not around anymore. In the beginning, the invitations to their funerals and stuff, my drawers are packed with hundreds of invitations. And then, so people say, man, that sounds like it's depressing. Or I said, no, man, it's triumphant. When you see cancer patients with the finish line in view, if I hadn't witnessed, I would say 95% are going to fall apart. But what I'm seeing is the opposite. A great majority find strength that they never knew they had. It's the fight that's bringing it out in them. They're not coming with coping mechanisms, because there's no way to cope for that word when it hits. And so it's inspiring for me to see how they navigate. They show up to clinic, they get dressed up every 3 months. They're like, what is this scan going to show? What is Rahul going to say? I mean, that's a lot of uncertainty and stress. And they cope, and they manage, and they're triumphant, and their dreams are positive. Not all. Some suffer. Some have miserable endings, no doubt. But a surprisingly large amount fare well, do well, when that finish line comes into view. So when I speak to them, what I realized is there needs to, I've implemented pauses, because it's too easy to just roll it out off of them. And so when you do talk to them about what has been found, I'll put in a deliberate 1 to 2 minutes. Just let them run through all of the things they're thinking about. What does this mean? What are my kids? What am I? What's this going to be? Is it going to be painful? Like, let them have some space to think about cancer. And then when I try to read their energy, I try to understand their story, and as I feel like they've caught their breath, there's a free fall. And as I feel like once they've caught their breath, then I get into, if it's appropriate, the hope and the positive options in front of them. If it's appropriate. It's I'm not there to be their cheerleader. In fact, the opposite. I am their partner through what's going on in their body. So I always show their scan. This is your name. This is your brain. This big white thing is a cancer. How do we tackle that? And I think they understand things like, you have months and likely years, but not decades. So I've learned to pull back my language rather than saying, studies for this cancer show that there's in that moment, they need a framework, time to run their thoughts, brace them with some general concepts, and I give them holidays. So the next few months will be tough, but when we get to Christmas, you will have a wonderful Christmas. And so they have a pace, they have a finish line, they have these things. So that's after 10,000 patients, So it's a very personal question. But that's where a lot of these lessons are coming from. They tell me about their dreams. I see their injury from their disease, and then I get it to the Petri dishes, to these conversations, to the little stickers on the electrode. I'm trying to pull from everything to come up with what's the unified theory of what's really going on in our heads.
Amazing answer.
Thanks,
and I think
man.
you're right when it's a privilege to have those conversations as much as it's a
the
challenge.
ultimate classroom.
Yeah, I bet. Right, quick fire questions.
All right.
What are the 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you, and ideally the people around you as well, would buy into?
One is that no matter who the person is, before I open them up, it's 100% dialed, 100% respect. That the what I feel about the patient, because sometimes we had to take care of patients who were in jail. You had to, the complex, the interactions when you see 10,000. But once that drape is on, I'm 100%. And so it's a sacred space for me, not just the operating theater, but inside your body, it's sacred every time, for every patient. That you can count on. The second thing is limitations, knowing my limitations. If there are 100 neurosurgical operations, there's a handful. I feel like at the other centers throughout the world, my performance measures. But there are things that I know other people are better than me at. Maybe they've trained more in it, or they have an aptitude at it. I gotta pass the ball if somebody else can take a better shot, and I do that in my practice to know my limitations. That you may be served best going to my partner for this type of operation. I've learned to say that too.
Great.
One example would be going through the nose to tinker with a pituitary gland. I can do that, but somebody does that better. I'd rather have you go to them. That's also respect. And the other thing I think is attitude. In that operating room, there's like 7 or 8 people, the anesthetist, there's technicians are going to hand me stuff, there's people on the back wall. There's a lot. It's a physical place. Machines, cables, that in the past I used to come in and say, I would tell people about the importance of the stage. And now I think it's the subtleties, it's the attitude. When I'm there first and the counter's all clean and the trash cans where I want them, they're like, oh, he's dialed today. Then that attitude is infectious. Rather than saying, I need your best today, and all the rotten, no. It's just the look in the eye. Then I walk back to the person opening all the tools up and say, I need this one, this one. Yeah, you good today? Yeah. It's that they see, if my attitude, he's super focused, he's super calm, that's the best way to get the most out of those 8 people. Rather than a checklist on the wall and a song or a speech, it's to set the attitude of the room. So if I run into trouble, if we run into rough weather, I've already got them on board. So when I dial it up, they knew that this was a possibility because he came in early that day. He was setting it up like this today.
Great.
Thank you.
If you could go back to one moment in your life, where would you go and why?
It's the moment I live all the time. It's the first time I showed up at LAX, and it was like, wow, there's this blue ramp coming out of Tom Bradley International Terminal at the apex of the horseshoe. People always say, where were you born? I said, LAX. Because that's really when my memory started. I was age 8. And now when I fly home tomorrow, when I came out here last night, when I go to LAX, it's like this recurrent dream, if you will, of where anything is possible in Los Angeles at LAX. When you come out of that ramp, it's infinite.
Nice.
What's your greatest strength and your biggest weakness?
I think my strength is realizing that I've come to a real acceptance that this isn't forever through my cancer patients. So I'm trying to leave my mark on the world that will last, but it comes from this recognition of our impermanence. That the meaning of life, I've come to accept. I think it was somebody else who wrote this, but the meaning of life is that it ends. That it's a short run, and I'm going for it. So I think that attitude is my strength. And my weakness is that I can perseverate on my failures. You would think, like, look at all the good stuff you've done. No, man, there's like 4 or 5 mistakes and things and regrets that I can't shake,
Yeah.
It's a personal answer.
Yeah. You've played a game of high stakes there with your life, haven't you? So.
Yeah, actually, I like that. High stakes, and I hope high performance.
And the final question, with all you've seen, learned, done, experienced, the good and the bad, the positive and the negative, what would you like to leave ringing in the ears of the people that have watched this conversation for them to find their own version of high performance?
The biggest thing about performance is to be dedicated in learning and training, and then be open to something transcendent happening unexpectedly.
Well, I can't thank you enough, for coming on the show and sharing so much of your lived experience with us. And I think it's a great reminder that the power of the brain, the complexity of the brain, it so often derails us. But actually, I think it's a reminder of just how incredible it is and just the amazing things it does for us. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.